Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. We're still in the midst of the off season, but the good news is we are nerds around here, and that means we like arguing about minutia. And in honor of that, we have a special guest on, Devin Dignam, who you may recognize as one of the editors of the Wages of Wins back in the day. So we're getting the old band back together. We made some random comments about movies back in the day, and very much like many of our guests, it's a small discussion leads into, I want to argue with you on your podcast for an hour, and you know what? There's no NBA basketball, and with apologies to the WNBA, I'm not going to be that asshole. It's like, I just don't enjoy watching it. I'm going to be another asshole and say I have a 3-year-old and I have a number of hobbies I'm already into, and I wanted to get into the WNBA this season and it fell to the back burner, but it is a plan for next season. So we might talk a little WNBA, but in terms of our normal wheelhouse, the NBA discussion, last week we talked football. So, Devin provides a welcome recompense to talk stuff that, if you don't care about, you don't care about. But good news, we will start the show with a little NBA. Sorry for that long preamble. Devin, anything you want to say to the listeners?
Not really. No, that's been a long time.
I gave you so much time to prepare. Like, if that was a stall tactic, like if this was the theater and it's like someone forgot a line, I gave you hours. But okay, that's very Canadian. I was going to say that was the funny part before I introduce Brian myself. I'll say the back and forth. We were basically having a discussion argument, whatever you want to call it, about quality of movies. And in your email to me, you actually said the line, which was like the most Canadian thing ever. You're like, how about we do this instead? I don't really want to just argue and fight. I want to have a discussion. And I'm not worried. We're going to be far more cordial on this because I think we're actually on the same side on the discussion we're going to have about quality of movies degrading over time. But I was chuckling a little to myself about that.
Well, right. It's kind of like, you can, if you want to argue about movies, it can devolve into kind of one person saying, I like this movie, and then the other person saying, I don't like it. And that's about it. Because people have different tastes, and it's hard to really provide a solid reason necessarily for why you like or don't like a movie.
Although I think we're going to be talking about kind of like overall quality, and I have some good arguments, maybe some stuff off the top of my head. We'll see, and we'll see if you agree or disagree. But I don't really think it's much of an argument. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say, hey, Brian.
Oh, what's going on, Dre? And yeah, it's so great to have Devin on. Like we were saying, it's been since before 2013 since he's been on the show. It's so great.
Well, another interesting part, a kind of a retired blogger, Ty Willinghans, who we bring up all the time, who is the ultimate Bucks fan. He actually said if the Bucks won the NBA title, he would come on the show. They didn't win the title, and I bugged him a few times, but he hasn't really responded about coming onto the show to talk. So I guess maybe the rule is, I don't know. Canada's a pretty big place, and so like Toronto, I don't know if you'd consider it close to you or whatever. I forget. We've discussed. You live in.
No.
Oh, so it's very much the same as being like, well, the San Antonio Spurs won the title, so Colorado fan, you can represent them because it's a big country. But anyway, I guess Toronto.
Well, let's nail this down though, Dre. There is a hardcore Raptors fan amongst the old school Wages of Wins people. So was it Devin or was it someone else? I wasn't sure.
You were kind of right. You were.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's hard to say hardcore. Raptors. Yeah, they were the team that I followed, but it's
okay.
In terms of being a fan, I'm not a good fan because I don't really care about the laundry, so to speak. I care more about the players.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So
same boat. And I've said the same joking thing about like the Denver Nuggets. I have wanted to quit the Denver Nuggets and they just won't let me. It was like Dikembe Mutombo and then Marcus Camby. And then I was like, Marcus Camby's gone. Good riddance. And it's like Chauncey Billups and Kenneth Faried. And I was like, fine. Oh, you're disrespecting Faried. And then Jokic shows up. So it's kind of like, yeah, I've stayed fans of my respective teams, basically the Nuggets and the Bucks, but it's really because they both have an MVP caliber player that I really enjoy.
Yeah, like in terms of, oh, sorry, I keep interrupting you, Dre, there. in terms of the Raptors, for years, following the Raptors was obviously pretty difficult because they were not very good for the longest time. And then even when they made the playoffs, they were kind of still not really good because they had guys like DeRozan on the team. And so I basically was hoping for the Raptors to trade DeRozan for like, I don't even know how many years. It was like 7 years where I said, is this the summer the Raptors trade DeMar DeRozan? Is this the summer the Raptors trade DeMar DeRozan? And then they finally did it, and it was for Kawhi Leonard. So I was like, well, now that I'm not even really following the team, now they do that. So it's like, well, damn.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The Raptors as a team were amazing and remind me a lot of the current Rockets in that they were this team that actually did have some really good players that just kept having a starter that took up so much money and so much time and so many shots. And, it was Andrea Bargnani initially, who we mentioned. Andrea Bargnani essentially chased Chris Bosh off that team because Chris Bosh wanted to play for a winner, and, they only, I think, made the playoffs once with him. Then, of course, they go to DeMar DeRozan. At one point when Masai Ujiri took over the team, they had DeMar DeRozan, Andrea Bargnani, and Rudy Gay. So it's like that team has always just kind of gone, what if we give a bunch of money and shots to suboptimal players? And so that is the funny thing is they are almost like a story you wish more people would watch or listen to. They remind me a lot of the Detroit Pistons, the 2004 ones that won a title, in that they won it in all of these unconventional methods, right? The Raptors last season won without a lottery pick, right? None of their starters were lottery picks. I don't think they had a lottery pick that got major minutes.
Well, they did have a lottery pick.
Lowry might have been low lottery. No, he was second round, wasn't he?
Well, Valanciunas was a lottery pick, but they traded him during the season.
Yeah, so that team without any lottery picks made the finals. That team went all in on a player that even though he left won. And so it's like there's all these lessons to be learned from the Raptors and they'll be lost forever. And it reminds me very much of the Detroit Pistons where it's like they got all of these underrated defensive players off the discard pile, right? Chauncey Billups was injured, so they got him for nothing. They got Ben Wallace in a parting gift trade for Grant Hill. And I mean, he wanted to come over anyway, but why did he want to come over? Because the Orlando Magic weren't doing anything. They got a good 3-and-D guy for nothing out of the draft in Tayshaun Prince. They found he probably heard it a little bit. Rasheed Wallace. They managed to get him because he was he was a Jimmy Butler player, had attitude issues with the coach. It's like they grabbed all these players. They made it to 7 straight conference finals, won a title, and then as soon as they were done, nobody was like, let's take that blueprint. But everybody is still following the San Antonio Spurs and Oklahoma City Thunder blueprints of, tank and hope you luck into 2 or 3 amazing talents in the draft immediately.
Although, interestingly, Dre, the Spurs have all those old Raptors players we were just talking about now.
Yeah, the Spurs are like, hey, with proper coaching, those players that couldn't make the playoffs can barely make the playoffs out west. It's like, imagine that with good players. All right, let's talk. First off, our sponsor is going to work really well with one of our show topics. So Daily Fantasy, if you haven't heard of it, you have not listened to a podcast, including this one. But anyway, football season is back, which means it's fantasy sports time and, more importantly, daily fantasy sports time. So if you head over to dailyroto.com, they have projections, ratings, an optimizer, everything you need to win at daily fantasy sports. If you use promo code NERDNUMBERS at checkout, they'll give you 10% off. Everything you need to prove that you know everything about sports, and they have a lot of stuff there, a lot of tools. So you don't just have to use the ratings they give you. You can tune them to your needs and be a master at daily fantasy sports. All right, and we're definitely going to talk sports betting, but actually before that, I was going to do last week on Lost. We did have one comment from last week's show. We were talking about ninja headbands and the conspiracy theory that Nike doesn't want them in the NBA because Nike doesn't produce them, ergo they're unprofessional. John, I'm assuming John Cheney on Twitter, actually corrected me and let me know that Nike does in fact make ninja-style headbands that are used in tennis. So last week, Brian, we were trying to be optimistic. Maybe the NBA, it's a capitalist thing, not a racist thing. And apparently the ninja-style headbands are professional in tennis, but not in basketball.
We'll see. I think this is one of those things where, like, the NBA is a big corporation, and they're like, the Titanic trying to avoid an iceberg. So they're probably trying to steer the boat in the right direction here, but being very slow and careless about it.
Interesting metaphor for the optimism there. But let's get on with topic one. We actually gave this as homework to the listeners, and Devin, you are a great person to have on this as well. Unlike me, you actually try your hand at football. I gave up years ago at both fantasy football and daily fantasy football, at least seriously, because it is really, really difficult. Football is the most random sport, and we're going to talk the Freakonomics episode on sports betting, which also really dove into daily fantasy sports because a lot of the daily fantasy sports providers in the United States have now turned to sports betting because the Supreme Court ruled that I forget, it's PASPA is what it stands for, but the bill that initially outlawed online gambling may have been struck down essentially by the Supreme Court, which means sports wagering is starting to come about, and these companies that went into daily fantasy sports are most equipped to basically handle it. And Freakonomics discussed it with the CEO of DraftKings about the future of sports betting, and then a sports economist we like, Victor Matheson, about it as well. And so we definitely had some thoughts, and you're a good person to have as a subject matter expert as well. Brian assumed immediately that I was going to complain about it because I don't like anything. So it's not a bad assumption. But I was going to say, just at the top, I'll throw this out to you first, Devin, then Brian. But I think I actually, for the most part, liked it, thought it was a pretty positive podcast. And compared to other things that I would argue I know about, and then you hear mainstream on and you go, oh, that's not the right way. Basketball analytics happens all the time, right? You hear mainstream talks, even on things like Freakonomics about basketball analytics. I'm like, no, actually, that one's all right. How about you, Devin?
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the email, I generally, and on a podcast, it's ironic for me to say this, but I generally don't listen to too many podcasts. I read transcripts when I can because it saves a lot of time for me anyways. So I read the transcript and I thought it was actually a really good general introduction to how the original kind of, as they call rotisserie, the original fantasy sports started, and then transitioned into daily fantasy sports, and then that has since transitioned kind of into sports betting. So for me, I actually liked it. It's a good kind of general overview. It doesn't get too heavy into anything in any particular area really, but it has a nice overview that for people who are unfamiliar with all that stuff can listen to that or read the transcript and go, well, now I have actually kind of a good understanding of everything that's going on with that stuff.
And yeah, and Brian, how about yourself? I said I'd be surprised on this week's show by your thoughts. Did you have anything that stood out as good or bad about it to you, or just overall thoughts?
Yeah, no, as the kind of the layman here out of the three of us, I agree. Like, there's a lot I learned from that, and just kind of, and this is, so to be fair, this is right in Freakonomics' wheelhouse, right? This is what they do the best. They take some kind of a topic that's a little more technical and has, kind of a detailed history, and they really do a good job of laying it out, for people that aren't experts like me. So yeah, that is what I enjoyed the most about it. So actually, right at the end of the show last week, when we ended a little abruptly, I'll kind of rehash what I was talking about, what my favorite part, which was they interviewed I guess she's an economist who they hired, I guess DraftKings hired, or maybe DraftKings and FanDuel, to do this third party analysis of whether sports betting, or in their case daily fantasy, how skill based it is, and then compared to the actual sports themselves. So that part I think was the most interesting to me. So I don't know if you Dre, you or Devin want to talk about that some more.
I mean, the interesting part is the way daily fantasy sport got legalized was kind of legislators hoisting themselves on their own petard, because they basically left in a loophole for fantasy sports, not anticipating daily fantasy sports. And as every freaking clever late night show host thought in the midst of the DraftKings FanDuel controversy back in the day, which was when they were just bombarding the airways with commercial, and then people thought there was insider trading going on. We'll leave that on the floor for this one. I have lots of thoughts on that, but I just assume rather not rehash anything about it. And in fact, if you go back in the archives, I think we talked about it at the time. But everybody was like, ho, 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 this is really gambling. Ha ha, we got you. And what really happened was you'll notice a lot of hypocrisy in lawmakers, especially in the United States. Shocker. And so it's kind of like they want to go, this form of gambling, right? Betting on the outcome of sports is gambling because you don't know what you're doing, whatever. But, the stock market is fine or whatever. And poker people were incensed by this because this bill explicitly struck down poker essentially with an interpretation of it. So saying picking players that are going to do well in sports is a game of skill, whereas playing poker, where I can show you exact odds at any moment, how likely you are to win a given hand, and then I can analyze how good you are at playing against that and analyze how good you are, and the best poker players are very, very good at that. It's infuriating. So there is a lot of hypocrisy in U.S. laws, but that was the entire thing. This bill came about to say they defined it as a game of skill, which is what daily fantasy sports really glommed onto. And that's the lawmakers' fault, essentially, because the argument of you're gambling, it's luck, fine. That's insurance. That's the stock market. That's deciding to drive on the highway to work. So many things, if you really want to say there's a chance something bad will happen, are gambling. So to me, it's kind of silly to say this qualifies. But the skill part was really key. And what she said is, if you look at how predictable certain sports are, they basically line up exactly. Picking players that are good at sports lines up exactly with how much the variance is in sports, which basically she was saying on like kind of a spectrum of like flipping a coin versus, I don't know, doing something perfect. I forget the example she used. They were basically about the 2/3 to 3/4 mark daily fantasy sports. Yeah. And it's really sport. And that like basketball is the best. And then I think hockey, she said, was the worst in terms of skill-based, if you were calling it that.
Yeah, right. Specifically that the skill or luck of an individual daily fantasy sport maps directly to the skill of the sport itself, right? The real players. That was the really interesting finding to me. Also, and like you said, yes, basketball more predictable than hockey because hockey has so few scoring chances, whereas basketball has many, many possessions. So that smooths out the good or bad luck. And then, of course, coin flipping is the most random. That's 50-50. And then, like you said at the beginning of that comment, Dre, she said that stock market, buying stocks is more random than any of that stuff almost, except for flipping a coin.
Yeah. And actually, I'd be interested in how soccer would compare with the major, the four major U.S. sports, North American sports, because I'm sure they didn't bother to add it to the analysis because DFS soccer even still hasn't really taken off that much.
That's surprising.
And I would think that soccer would probably be very close to hockey, I would imagine, because it's pretty low scoring.
I have a theory about that. Let me know what you guys think about this. A hot take. So soccer is a lot more popular in Europe. And in Europe, there's just legalized sports betting. Like you can just go bet in your local tavern, right? So maybe they don't want daily. I know there's a distinction. I don't want to say it's the same, but maybe for a lay person, it might be the same.
I'll kind of say this lovingly in a nice, mean way about daily fantasy sports. We talk a lot about startups and we praise the book Blitzscaling a lot about this idea of you want to be first to market, you want to get there fast, you care more about speed than efficiency or a perfectly polished product, right? You really are trying to get a computer put together with, plywood and duct tape, which was like the original computers that, basically did win. Mac back in the day was a kit they sold in the store. And a lot of times the case was made out of wood because that's, was more affordable. That kind of logic trumps like a perfectly polished product. Both FanDuel and DraftKings have done well in past years to improve their UI, etc. But anybody that's been a fan of daily fantasy sports from the beginning is just aware that there is a constant barrage of complaints about how frustrating their UI is. And any modern daily fantasy sports player that wasn't back, 5 or 6 years ago would be amazed at some of just the UI problems that they used to have that were super frustrating. And so from that regard, that's the funny thing. In the United States, even if you consider daily fantasy sports apps sports betting, and I used to be skittish about saying that back in the day because of, all the stupid legalized stuff, but now with the Supreme Court ruling it down, I'm less so. That's like 5 or 6 years old, where any sports book in Europe has been around for a much longer time. So I could my 2 cents on it is I could just literally buy that fans of soccer would just go, this app is so much shittier compared to the app I have now. Of course, the end game, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Devin. It was like Paddy Wagon or something. I forget what they're called.
Oh yeah. So Paddy Power is the name of the betting site. They
Paddy
bought
Power
FanDuel, right?
Betfair. Yeah.
Because DraftKings wasn't able to legally or something like that. Tell me what happened there.
Well, FanDuel and DraftKings wanted to merge, and they were shot down by the SEC, FCC, one of the CCs, one of the exchange commissions, that said it was a monopoly because they'd have too much of the market share.
And so Paddy Power is really big. So if they bought them, then maybe Europe does think there's a future in daily fantasy.
Well, I think Paddy Power, the big reason for Paddy Power to get FanDuel, to acquire FanDuel, is now they have access to U.S. customers, potential U.S. customers for betting.
And I mean, that could be a good or bad thing, because back in the day, early daily fantasy sports days, it was funny because I think we were talking this pre-show, Devin. You noted that the story that's kind of told on the Freakonomics episode is kind of DraftKings as a startup discovering this idea and getting into the field, when the reality is DraftKings was really the epitome of what the early mover disadvantage, I've heard it called in business, like the first search engines, the first computers, all of that, the first phones, like they weren't the ones that won. Facebook won after watching other people iterate and fail and learn what to do right. And
you don't use MySpace anymore, Dre?
Yeah, exactly. So there was a site called Draft Street, which was very much like MySpace. This site that was the biggest deal. They had these big commercials, whatever. It's kind of a shame that they disappeared, because they were one of the nicer sites about like things like rewarding players and all that. They were acquired. Apologies if my phone dinged on the call, but they were acquired by Draft Street back in the day, and it literally was, we just want your client roster, and then they shut them down. So, I would doubt that Paddy Power would shut down FanDuel as a potential market, but I could see that being the case, where you're saying they're just interested in the U.S. customer role more so than necessarily improving the daily fantasy sports product. But I haven't looked into that at all.
That makes some sense to me. Like it's not that they want to use it for their European customers more. It's more like, we have Europe locked down, we need to get into North America. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the big idea behind what they're doing. And in terms, this is a whole can of worms that we probably don't really want to go into. But to me, with the whole sports betting getting more legal in U.S. states as more states legalize it, to me it looks like daily fantasy sports it's certainly not going to grow anymore, and it may start shrinking as people get more comfortable with making bets and gambling.
I'd be curious if there's a synergy for because I could definitely see the following happening. You want to bet on a game, and the odds are just, you have some inside info, right? Or not inside info, that's the wrong way to phrase it. You feel you have some inside as to say, I'm just, Tom Brady is a beast, right? That's why I know they're going to win by 17 today, but the line set at 17, I can't make any money there. But I think he's going to be underowned in daily fantasy sports. And conversely, I could see someone who plays daily fantasy sports, if there is a little alert that comes up and says, hey, you're playing daily fantasy sports, are you aware the line in the New England game just moved -3 points? And you're like, are you kidding? Antonio Brown and Tom Brady are going to go off for so many points today. I got to bet that. I could see there being synergy there. On the same hand, to actually disagree at the same time, Devin, the economist take, there have been some interesting maneuvers by both DraftKings and FanDuel that you go, if you play this right, I think there's a future, but there's nothing that, businesses are weird, so who knows?
Yeah, so can I ask you guys about this? What I got out of, kind of the later half of the conversation with the DraftKings guy was, it seems like he basically confessed, yeah, the reason we started doing daily fantasy is just to get our foot in the door for legalized betting. That's what we're really the most interested in. We're laying the groundwork for that. And so maybe then in the future, it's going to be a different product or set of products that's kind of a hybrid of betting and daily fantasy that maybe has both this could be a way forward instead of one or the other. I don't know what I'm saying here, but
Yeah, I don't know. Like, obviously, I don't know. It's Jason Robbins who
Right.
was in the podcast, so I've never spoken to him personally. I don't know any of his, his personal ideas on why he started the company or any of the actual real reasons for starting the company. But to me, my guess is they started trying to play daily fantasy sports. That's my guess. And I think just kind of in the future, they were thinking more like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years into the future, they were thinking, well, maybe sports betting will get legalized, because the way it seemed to happen in the US was kind of sudden. Like, it kind of all of a sudden, I guess it was the Supreme Court, Dre, maybe you know more than I do, but it was just one decision, and then now states can legalize it if they decide to. So it seemed like just kind of all of a sudden it opened up after they had so many court cases that were going on for so long.
I know this is turning into a daily fantasy sports history lesson, which I'm fine with. It's the off season and it's more related than some of the movie stuff. So I'll finish a history lesson, get onto my complaints with the thing, and we'll move on from there. But what you were talking about there, what's fascinating is daily fantasy sports did this weird thing, in my opinion. We kind of watched it happen, where they, because of something called, I'm not calling it Ethan Gate. I hate Gate at the end. Gate at the end of anything is stupid. There was a scandal with an employee from DraftKings. It was briefly mentioned on the podcast at Freakonomics, where people were alleging an employee had insider information. The 2 cents I've given on it before is, at best, it was not protected data in the way a big company with that much data really should have been protecting it, but it does not appear there was foul play because he played on an opposing site, and there was no guarantee that he was doing anything wrong. And they had a big audit that says everything should be fine there. So is what it is. That caused daily fantasy sports to come under scrutiny, which made the daily fantasy sports companies, DraftKings and FanDuel, team up to pass a lot of legislation. And they were even attempting to merge before it was struck down. They got a lot of legislation passed to make daily fantasy sports legal in a lot of states. And that, I think, really laid the groundwork for a lot of the sports betting. So that's kind of the interesting part. You're saying the daily fantasy sports companies weren't anticipating sports betting getting pushed this quickly, because that's what happens with laws like that. If it's a bill, you have to get in front of the Supreme Court, and that can take years, and they have to decide to see it. Daily fantasy sports pushed up the importance of that, and then as a result, it got much faster. So it's a weird how we came to where we are now. And then the funny part about that is all of that legislation to make daily fantasy sports legal in states put the companies, DraftKings and FanDuel, that were legal companies to operate, because there are things like operating fees, et cetera, in states for this to happen. It put them in an advantage. So that's the full set of steps. And I think based on how I've told that, it could be very obvious that neither FanDuel or DraftKings, that was what they expected. None of them in investor meetings were like, well, an employee's going to do something stupid, and then we're going to have to pass a lot of laws, and then we're going to have to, we're basically going to have to become a lobbying company somehow and team up with a competitor and try to merge, and then we're not going to merge, but as a result of that, but that is what happened. In terms of complaints, because that's what Brian said, Jason Robbins mentioned the rake was about 10%. The way to think of this is, if you go to a site to bet $1 to bet, the site basically says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take your dollar. I'm going to take off some amount. Usually it's 10%. I'm going to put that 90 cents in the middle, and then you bet on that. And Vegas does the same thing, too, with over-unders. You'll notice, like, it's not minus 100 plus 100. It'll be like minus 110 plus 2.
And just to clarify real fast, Ray, you're saying this is complaints about the Freakonomics episode itself, right? Not general daily fantasy. Yeah,
I've got tons of complaints there, but that's another show. But the Freakonomics episode, because that's what you said, Brian, you're like, Dre will come back with complaints. He said the rake was about 10%, and he did a lot of this. He would say about this much, about this thing. And I can just say the rake in the popular tournaments that are on daily fantasy sports sites are nowhere close to 10%. They're closer to about 15 to 16% now. And that's very much like three-point shooting in the NBA. If I say a player is about a 40% three-point shooter, and you say, I looked it up and he's a 33% three-point shooter or 35, I'm like, there's a world of difference between those two statements. So,
yeah, actually, thinking about it, he probably said 10% because he knew that he could use the cash games and the 50-50s as kind of the 10% rule. And he could make the argument that most of the contests on the site are going to be the cash games. So if you want to get technical about it, you go, well, most of our contests have a 10% rig.
So, I mean, I guess what I'll give that, and this is I phrased it this way, I think pre-show, I don't know if it made it on the air, but I was like, Jason Robbins clearly knew this was a commercial opportunity. Commercial meaning using the media to say something that'll relate to another story later in the show, to talk about daily fantasy sports, and he did take advantage of that. And we've actually said this is a complaint we have about the media a lot, which is someone will come in front of a camera and say a number, and the person just is like, cool, and they report it. You know, X many NBA teams are losing numbers. Zach Lowe will write that article. And people will say, Zach Lowe asked him, and that's what they said. And you're like, they weren't like, he's not, Zach Lowe's not going to subpoena him. He's not a judge. They can say whatever they want. And if you don't do any follow-up, you know, that's my general rule. Like, if you don't see the data and you see a report, you can be a little skeptical about it. So that was the thing here. He did a very good job of saying things like about. So if he ever did go to court, he'd say, well, I said about, and that means this. But there weren't concrete numbers, and I'm just saying you could be a little trepidatious about that. And the rake thing is what made my spider sense go off. I was like, if this isn't true and you're saying hundreds of millions on this and you're a company trying to IPO, I would at least say do more research if any of that stuff is important to you as an investor, client, et cetera. So that was complaint number one. They brought up paying college athletes as a huge thing. And what was interesting is there was an economist on Victor Matheson who was saying no NBA player is going to throw a game because they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars. But an NCAA athlete that's just getting paid in tuition and room and board, which isn't worth that much, even if you're like, it's worth $30,000, you're like, no, if you can resell it, right? It's I'd say it's very much like a wedding ring. If you spend $10,000 on a wedding ring for someone, and you say it's a $10,000 wedding ring, my reply to you is take that $10,000 wedding ring and try and sell it, and you'll see what it's worth. Same with school tuition. So anyway, he's saying that sports betting in college sports is ripe for corruption because of that. And for what it's worth, daily fantasy sports in the early day used to have college sports, daily fantasy sports contests, and backed out because they didn't want to fight with the NCAA over claims of that.
Although I do think, let me just check this, but I'm pretty sure they brought it back recently. Let me just look.
If that's true,
yeah. That's a big can of worms, the NCAA this week. There's a really big story.
They have, I'm looking at DraftKings right now, and they do have football available. So, and I see a tab for college basketball, so it's all come back.
Arturo tweeted something out that's really interesting, guys. He said there's a non-trivial chance that this is the last year of the NCAA, that next year there's going to be a domino effect based on this California law. So we probably don't want to get into that, but that's a big topic.
This is like 2 weeks in a row, Brian. I've just forgotten to put a big story on the script.
Yeah. There's no time for it.
Yeah, I'll at least do the big broad overview and then also explain how daily fantasy sports is wrong. And I think maybe we can get on with our main topic. But I was just going to say, Victor Matheson's argument is, if you pay the players, they're less likely to be, corruptible, to get paid to throw games. For what it's worth, that's an interesting thing. The guy in Goodfellas actually was fixing college basketball games, which is an interesting story in and of itself. So that's the argument. But I think that I said I had a problem with that argument, and that just because someone is paid does not mean the thing is free of corruption. Tim Donaghy was an NBA referee making a ton of money, and he still bet on games in a really stupid fashion, honestly, if you look at, because, he basically had gambling problems and then was basically coerced into giving insider information on NBA games as a result. And then he also bet on those games. So it's like, I think you have to be careful when you get this belief of, oh, if we pay it, there won't be corruption or there won't be issues. It wasn't a big issue, but those were my two major ones, Brian.
Well, I'll say briefly on that so this is a thing from political science literature, and I don't know how well that transfers over to sports, but yeah, political science corruption research does say that basically, civil servants that are paid more are less likely to be corrupt. because of that mechanism we're talking about. But of course, it's not perfect, right? It's just system-wide, not individual-wide. And I think that's what happened with Donaghy, like you said. He was compromised to the point where he had to keep doing what the mob said.
And then, yeah, we get into all sorts of other interesting things. And then the big story that you were mentioning, I believe it was California, similar kind of point that you're making, Devin, because the Daily Fantasy was New Jersey argued against this bill. The Supreme Court said they're not allowed to do that. You can do it at the state level, and that changed things. And I believe California just said student athletes are allowed to be paid. And and obviously the issue with that is California as a NCAA state is freaking giant. So many, right? I mean, I think the NBA, UCLA, right, is probably the all-time system for all-time greats, I think.
Yeah, UCLA is really good at NCAA. Stanford wins, the President's Cup for all the sports very often. And, of course, USC is big in football. So, yeah, there's a lot of big California schools. So this is Arturo's theory, and it makes sense, right? What he's saying is basically the California schools start paying their players. The Pac-12, which is where most of those schools are in, the big ones, can't stop them from paying their players. So then what happens? All the players start going to those schools. And then are the other Power 5 conferences going to say, oh, we're just not going to compete with the Pac-12 and pay our players? No. They've been close to paying their players for a long time and kicking the NCAA to the curb for quite a while now. So this is just kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back and gets all the power conferences rushing to pay their players because they'll be at a competitive disadvantage. So this is Arturo's theory, and I agree with it, but the question is just how long will it take for this to happen? And will there be appeals and other kind of legal stuff going on? So,
yeah, I saw that too, and it's very convincing that it should be pretty soon that the NCAA will have to pay at least something to players, and it could be the collapse of the NCAA. So,
because what do they provide at this point? Because the leagues have their own TV contracts now. So the NCAA doesn't do very much for the power conferences, I would say. The BCS could just take over and say, okay, we're the BCS now, our own version of the NCAA.
Well, of course, they enforce all the very valuable NCAA rules surrounding eligibility and, punishing players for accepting money for dinner.
And think about how bad the SEC wants to get rid of all that stuff, though, for instance.
I don't know college conferences well enough, but yeah, I mean, I think that will be the thing. And it's amusing where I'm seeing people say this will be the death of college sports, because the irony is, if their argument is money will corrupt college sports, be horrible, it's not. They already have schools that have huge amounts of money that is being brought in by sports that give them a competitive advantage, right? All of the major recruitment schools win year after year after year. It's like, it's already there. The question is just, are you allowed to give it to people? And we've talked enough on the show, and don't worry, it's not going away, about the history of the United States and why there seems to be this random weird issue of like why people are really upset about paying a certain sect of people in the United States. It's kind of weird. It seems to have a trend though, but it's already a bloated enough show. You know what? We might have to kick movies on the curb, Devin. I apologize, or we can at least start it. I wanted to say this, it's in our wheelhouse. So I'm not even going to say the porn site or what they did. It is a little clever, but was stupid. A porn site offered $10 million in naming fees to the Miami Heat arena. And what frustrated me about this, and I saw this, I said, one story you could tell is porn site offers $10 million for naming rights of NBA arena. Another story you could tell is porn site pays $0 for tons of free advertising from NBA media. Yeah. And this is a regular subject that comes on the show where we compare like Adrian Wojnarowski to American politics media. I'd actually be curious how Canadian political media compares to the United States, Devin. And I'll ask you about that at the end. But I was just going to say, it is a common thing where just the media gets played so easily. We were just saying the same thing with Jason Robbins. He goes on a podcast that's an analytics-driven show, and he says some numbers, and they just report it. They just say it out loud, and, you could, I understand why. It's work. It's difficult to do a fact checker. Those numbers might not be publicly available, but the whole, we're just going to repeat what someone said at face value and put that in front of millions or thousands or whatever people. that technique in at least U.S. media is really efficient and effective and frustrating when you're someone that kind of tries to argue for the truth. So it was an example to me of how.
Yeah, in terms of like media, we can have you can have a series of podcasts on media and reporting and whatnot. But I think in general, the trends in U.S. kind of reporting and journalism they do come to Canada. Sometimes it takes a while, but it gets there. So we have the same type of kind of unquestioning, just parroting back what people say and not really going into it. Whereas I think in the past, journalists seem to do more work, kind of more questioning, and they weren't so worried about access. You want to talk about the access journalism. I think today a lot of reporters are worried about, if they say something critical, then they lose the access. And in the case of someone, say, like Donald Trump, that's been proven to be correct, where Donald Trump just kicks people out of the press corps when they say something negative about him. So I think a lot of today, it's just kind of doing the surface work, and we're supposed to be fair and balanced, or objective, and we have to present both sides and blah blah blah. So there's a lot of that going around. But in the case of this porn site, I think it was just a really smart move on their part to realize there's basically no chance that they were going to be able to put their name on the arena. So if we make any kind of offer, it's going to be free advertising. So to me, it was just smart.
Yeah, it's clever, but I'm saying it's kind of hate to give him any credit, because he's turned, like, everybody that you were like, oh, this person was interesting in the past turns into a jerk. Richard Dawkins he came up with the idea of the meme, and this idea of like an idea that propagates and spreads and all that stuff. And then he has since said he doesn't like how it's caught on, which I find nothing more fascinating than someone who comes up with an idea about how an idea spreads going, I didn't want it to spread like that. It's like, well, read what you said. But that idea of like an idea really wanting to spread and how they do it. And like I said, the United States media, at least, of how people learn how to hijack it and hack it and all that. And it gets frustrating where you see it happen. And I watch it and I was like, I know. And the biggest example that we talked a little on this show, Brian, was the Game of Thrones petition to rewrite season 8. Oh, I saw that number keep growing, and it was because the media was giving access to people that were making a stupid demand that you literally could have just said, this is stupid, and not given them any. But as soon as they gave them eyeballs, it just grew and grew and grew. And people realized that they're like, I can get someone to think something is outrageous, try and dunk on me on their headline. A bunch of other headlines pick it up, and suddenly it's everywhere. And there's not an easy solution to that, and it can be frustrating. That's all I got.
I think if people don't realize how this whole, being, it's hard to describe it, but how Donald Trump hogs media. I think Donald Trump, the way the media covered Donald Trump, has made what you're talking about pretty obvious, if it wasn't already. So I think if people are paying attention, they should already know about it.
Yeah, that's the incentives. Like all these media companies, you can look at the New York Times stock price and all that. Like they've gone up 50 to 100%, something like that, since 2016. So it's been great business for them, for sure. And so I think you were being a little bit generous, even. Well, I mean, not generous, but trying to be accurate anyway. I think you were being accurate. But let's say if you try to be more generous. So let's say they don't care about access. I'm going to be in there and be a hard-charging reporter. Well, there's an effect where Donald Trump lies to all of his surrogates even. So his surrogates go out there and think they're telling the truth, but they're actually lying, and then report. There's like so many layers of deception with all that. It's just absurd. But just to get back to your earlier point about the porn sponsorship, and here's the proof that what you guys are saying is right. The amount they offered for the sponsorship was $10 million, and the incumbent sponsor paid something like $25 to $30 million, like 2 to 3 times more. So that's the proof there that they knew they were never going to actually win it and just wanted the publicity.
And that's another great thing that comes up all the time in fooling people is, and I call this the Brian magnitude test on the show, Brian. Yep. It's something you do that I wish more people would do, which was whenever you are presented with a number or a metric or whatever, you just say, well, what's the net impact of that? And for what it's worth, mathematicians, statisticians, and economists, all of their tests have very boring things for this. The R squared is horrible, but the statistical significance is great. Or this really matters, but it's too noisy, that kind of stuff. And so that exact thing where, if I say 10 million, people just are like, oh, that's a big number. And this happens all the time in sports. Like, can you believe this athlete's making 2 million a year? And you just go, you're getting fooled by that number because behind the scenes, tens to hundreds of times that amount are going to the owners. And it's very effective to point at a player and say that player is making $20 million a year. They're Antonio Brown, $30 million. How dare they be it? And while you're watching over there, they're making billions on the other side. And it would be nice if I didn't see in any of the discussion of that, Brian. You actually make me happy when that's what I was talking about. Fact checking. No one brought that up. And that should have killed the story dead immediately. It's like, can I offer $1,000 to name the American Airlines Arena and just get a bunch of free advertising that would cost hundreds to thousands of dollars in Google AdWords? It's ridiculous.
Well, even that, there's no chance, I think, that site was going to get the naming rights. So they could have offered pretty much any amount of money at all, and it wouldn't have mattered. So they could have made a reasonable offer, and it still would have been fine.
You could have called it a bluff, though, because there is the outside chance that they're like, okay, or who knows if they I don't know if there's any FCC rules or regulations for that kind of stuff where they could have slapped them with a fine or whatever. So they might have, but who knows? It was still a good job. Well,
we have had the Smoothie King Center and the Power Balance Pavilion. So, is it really that much of a stretch?
And for what it's worth, the Smoothie King chose really good on the naming rights because that arena has on multiple times, we're talking daily fantasy sports, had issues with roof leakages and temperature systems such that games were randomly canceled at the last minute, which for sports betting and whatever is a horrible thing. One last just kind of tertiary shout out thing, Brian. We'll talk a little movies and then that'll be the show. Does that sound, how much time you got, Devin?
Oh, I have no idea. That's up to you.
Well, I've got a little bit more time, so I'll throw it out to Brian just to make sure.
Oh, yeah. We're only at 47 minutes, so we've got, 13 minutes at least to make an hour.
All right. But apparently the NBA is looking at saying that lineups have to be submitted 30 minutes before lock, which is amazing because I guess I didn't realize this was a rule, but it used to be 10 minutes before tip-off time. And the reason that matters for things like daily fantasy sports is, especially if there's things like lock, meaning when you have to get your entry submitted, or even bets, right? If I have to get a bet submitted before a game starts, or I'm worried the line's going to move if I don't get the bet in now, that kind of news is hugely important. And there have been some teams that have been very frustrating, and we've noted part of it is about tanking, right? Like players like and Anthony Davis and LeBron James are like, we don't know if we're playing because the team wants to try and lose the game, but they don't want to get in trouble for tampering. So they try and hide that news, but then that news impacts betting. And so I'm actually kind of happy that the NBA might be pushing towards that because that could be good for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'd look forward to that. But actually, one of the changes that they instituted, it was definitely in place last year, and I think it might have been partially in place the year before, was they started doing official injury reports every day for each team, each NBA team. And so there's a page, I just opened it up because I, of course, have it bookmarked, but there's a page on the NBA site, NBA.com, where you could go and it has the reports for every team every day. And I'll just read what it says, but it says the reports will be posted daily at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Eastern, and 8:30 p.m. Eastern. So they have those. And to me, that was a huge difference compared to all the rumor mongering that was going in the years before that.
Yeah, and there were definitely players that, you were like LeBron with back spasms, all that kind of stuff happening. So that is key. I mean, I didn't have any nice subtle way to tie all these points together, but yeah, it's like sports betting is real and we'll have to see what happens, but it is very interesting for the future of the sports landscape. I don't really care about FIBA that much. I mean, with apologies, after Nikola Jokic didn't make the finals, I was like, whatever. For those that don't know, that's international basketball. What was the specific tournament? Was it the World Cup or was it something?
Yeah, it used to be called the World Championship, but they renamed it a couple of years ago to the World Cup because it kind of piggybacks on FIFA. So
I'm surprised it's not like the Super Bowl in the United States where they're like, oh, hell no, you're not allowed to use that. You know, the NFL does the whole, we come to your city, we take all of your tax dollars, and heaven forbid if you're a store on the same lane where that's taking place, if you use Super Bowl anywhere in your advertisements, we're going to smack you down. And that gets really amusing for things like daily fantasy sports where you'll notice they're advertising. They're like, come play the big game contest because it's too expensive to use Super Bowl. So I'm amazed they were able to get away with World Cup.
yeah, that's actually a good question. I'd have to look it up. And the organizations, they're separate organizations. FIFA is soccer and FIBA is basketball. So it's not like they're part of the same organization. So it's kind of interesting.
So what was the full outcome of this? Obviously, the United States got beaten. The simple answer to the United States is they did not send a great team in the set. And I would actually call them very much like your Raptors back in the day, which we were talking at the beginning of the show. They have some good players. They have some very, very good players on that team, but they also had some horrible players that had no business being on an international team. It's funny. Donovan Mitchell actually looked decent in international play. Shocker when you shorten the three-point line, a player that we think doesn't shoot amazingly shoots better. But like why is Harrison Barnes? We were like, why is Harrison Barnes getting that contract for the Kings? And then even bigger, why would you, if you were selecting even from second, third tier NBA players, why would you pick Harrison Barnes?
Yeah, I think in the case of the U.S. men's team, it might have even been like, fourth option because there were so many people who pulled out of that. And the most concerning thing to me was, so leading up to the actual start of the tournament, one of the things that I read was, and Greg Popovich was coaching. So, he's a pretty good coach, but the reporting was Greg Popovich expects Harrison Barnes to play a really big part on the team. And so I went, let's take some bets against the United States to win this.
Well, one thing add about San Antonio and even Greg Popovich is, and Brian has had this about the Warriors as well, is like the success makes you drink your own Kool-Aid or even like view things as a challenge. Because what's amusing to us is we go, why the hell don't the Spurs just pick up good players and make them great? Why do they keep picking up mediocre players almost in an effort to say, see, DeRozan in the right coaching circumstances is a decent NBA player. See LaMarcus Aldridge in the right coaching circumstances is a good player. And both of those are true, but they spent so much money to basically just get their money back. And we go, if your coaching is that good, there had to have been undervalued players, which we've already seen. And that was players like Danny Green and Kawhi. It's like you were able to find undervalued players that you got way more for your money than, as opposed to finding like a beat up Honda Civic for $5,000 that you tune up and make it worth $10,000 and the blue book value of it is $10,000. That's what they did. So I do feel like when you're saying that about Greg Popovich, it's almost like, see, I'll prove how to use Harrison Barnes, as opposed to going, why don't you just get a better player? Like, why don't you start better than that?
Yeah, and I mean, you look at it, and I think in the show notes, I think it was described as kind of the U.S. team tries to go small ball, so there's a bit of that going on. But then there's also, look at the roster and who can shoot on the team.
Shooting is important.
Yeah. They did have Joe Harris, so obviously he's good. But it's like, do we really expect the U.S. team to be like feeding Joe Harris for, as many times as they should for threes when they have people like Donovan Mitchell and Harrison Barnes on the team and even Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown? So.
Yeah.
And actually, I forgot Kemba Walker, too. Don't forget Kemba Walker. So
Kemba Walker's interesting, where I think he's a fine player, but he's not worth – I don't want him for the contract he's currently at in the NBA on any team. So
if he's one of your best players in an all-star tournament like that, though, it's not a good sign, which he probably was. Now, I've got two different things on this. So first of all, like on why they're so bad and Harrison Barnes, it's – well, so we talk about this a lot. I guess this is my magnitude testing, and God damn it. But Harrison Barnes is the type of player who we want to like in this day and age. Like he's kind of big and strong. He can kind of rebound. He can shoot threes a little. The problem is, even though he's that type of player, he doesn't do the things well he's supposed to do well, right? And we say this about the Morris brothers too, for instance. Like the Morris brothers, the prototypical stretch fours, they're always going to get jobs in the NBA, but they're just kind of not good shooters or rebounders, and they just set out to do all the things they're supposed to do, but they don't do it very well. So maybe you're trying to do something good, but you're just not evaluating correctly, the way you want to do it. Second part of that is, and of course, let's say the small ball part too. Yes, we hate small ball here. They should have had some bigger players to complement those guys, of course, right? Second part is just the process of making the USA team in general. So Jerry Colangelo has been running Team USA for quite a while, and we're just not big fans of his. Like, we've talked a lot about how he's had bad success with Philadelphia, and of course, he was in Toronto, right, when they got Bargnani. So,
well, that was actually his son, Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry. I lumped the Colangelos together.
Well, yeah, they kind of, I think, I could be wrong, but I think Jerry Colangelo, I seem to remember him being connected to the Suns for a while back.
He was.
Whereas Brian Colangelo, yeah, he's a GM who's done stuff with the 76ers and the Raptors.
Right.
And
Jerry was just like a consultant to his son or something, right? On the 76ers.
Something like that.
Anyway, so I got the details wrong, but I think the point is here, like, Jerry Colangelo being the guy is probably a big reason why they have trouble recruiting. Like, I don't think, like, the good players would want to play for him, and then the players that he is able to recruit, I'm not sure he's going to be picking the right ones, based on his past track record. And there's even an article, this is the NBC Sports version right here. He has a quote about this saying, "I will remember who did not show up for the World Cup." It's like a threat, like he's going to punish these players down the road because he's Mr. USA basketball and he gets to say who gets to play or not. So, Jerry Colangelo's being paternalistic, and I think, like, if they got a more legitimate person running Team USA, they might be able to recruit better players.
I'm going to give the boring answer and say it doesn't matter. Like, it is the college sports of, like, giving all this concern to an organization that underpays or does all this weird stuff, or any international organization. Typically, I don't know FIBA as well, but I know FIFA and the Olympics screw over people that get their content. So it's like, I'm not usually a fan of international organizations having players that have very lucrative NBA contracts that they put at risk to play. I know Mark Cuban was in the same boat about, like, Dirk Nowitzki. He has so many international players. I know he's in the same boat of, like, I don't want my player getting hurt playing international ball. Don't forget Paul George got injured playing international ball. So it's Colangelo, like, I'm going to remember who didn't play. It's like, yeah, you're going to remember them because they're going to be winning titles. That's how you'll remember them. Anyway.
That's fair.
Yeah. I'll give, this might be the last talk on this bit, maybe, if you guys aren't too interested in it. But so first of all, Jerry Colangelo is 79, so it's not like he's going to be in charge for that much longer. He's going to have to retire at some point. So there's that point. But then there's also the point that I think pretty much there was no chance that the best players in U.S. players were going to join the U.S. men's team this season in particular, because the perception that the NBA is so wide open, probably, first of all, and also that there are lots of players who switch teams and sign new deals, and all of them are rightly worried about being in shape, in condition for the upcoming NBA season. So I think it was pretty unlikely that all the best players were going to suit up for the U.S. team. And then there's also the fact that it kind of goes in waves, where, at least lately, where the U.S. team was dominant for a while, and then people stopped caring. And so then they had their, I think it was 5th place finish in 2006 or something like that, 2005.
Right. That was Allen Iverson, Larry Brown.
Yeah.
Allen Iverson, Larry Brown. I know LeBron James and Wade and Mel. I think was Melo on that team too?
I think so.
But they came off the bench. So
yeah,
they were all young.
And even I think Amare and Tim Duncan were even on that team. So that team was actually quite a bit better than this team. But anyways, what happened there is it was kind of, oh no, the US didn't win. And so then there was kind of okay, we have to retool, we have to improve our process, we have to get all the good players back in. So over the next couple of years, then the US men's team had all its good players again. And now interest is waning again. And then there'll be a renewed call in the next couple of years for all the good players to suit up for the team again. And the US will probably win. And then same thing, lose interest again.
Yeah. I would also guess that the American players care more about the Olympics than the World Cup, so they might be gearing up for that. Speculation.
It's the same issue with like the Warriors, right? When players get older, we gave him credit for this. Gary Kasparov played in a chess tournament against the second highest ranked player in the world, Fabiano Caruana, and he lost. And he said, "I'm not rusty, I'm old." He's like, I'm what, 50s, 60s. He's like, I'm not supposed to freaking beat a young person in their prime that's second best in the world at this, even though I'm a former world champion. Yeah, like Carmelo Anthony, we actually give him some props on this show, despite the fact that we've been his fan club for hating him, right? I think I was Carmelo Anthony and you were Andrea Bargnani back in the day for just sheer content on how bad these players were. He did not get worse. He got old. Like, people are like, the game passed him by, It's like, no, you could take the Melo that played under D'Antoni, and he would be a perfectly fine, albeit extremely overpaid NBA player in the modern NBA. But you add on 5 years and however many thousands of minutes of basketball to that, including international play, and he's just not at the same level. So all of the top players on Team USA got old, and there's this vacuum, and that's the problem. It seems what happens with the NBA teams doing well in international play is a group of players come in together and agree to play together for a while. The exact same as like the Warriors. And then after a while, they get older, beat up, it falls apart, and you have to rebuild. And Jerry Colangelo should not be the person in charge of that.
We're nodding.
All right. Yep. You said something about Toronto on the script. I'll let you get that entrance beyond what we kind of said, Brian, and then I'll finish our last topic maybe quickly.
Oh, no, we already talked Toronto at the top of the show, so we can do movies or not, yeah.
At least it's funny. Obviously, we bait and switched you huge, Devin. We're like, we'll talk movies. And no, we're going to talk sports betting because you know what you're talking about there. And of course, for those that don't remember, back in the Wages of Wednesdays, you wrote a lot about college athletics paying sports players. We didn't even get into how you and I'm in the same boat. How you wrote a lot about like the steroid, oh my gosh, pearl clutching crap is just that. So anyway. Check out old Wages of Wins from about 2013 if you want a lot of great content on that. But we said we were going to talk movies. And the basic point is we were talking about how movies have gotten better, but then maybe worse. Because we brought up the Flynn effect and then also generational talent. The Flynn effect, for those that don't know, this guy named James Flynn observed basically IQ measurements or any type of intelligence test, because obviously intelligence tests have lots of issues, but is what it is. And essentially about every decade, each generation seems to be gaining about, I think, 10 IQ points. Don't quote me on that. Go look it up. It's out there. It's very easy to find. But essentially, like a person in the modern United States compared to someone of the same intelligence in terms of the bell curve, a couple decades ago, they were like a 70. So essentially, we've gotten much, much smarter than previous generations. It's not actually hard to see that. And the same is true of like the NBA. Any modern NBA team would just destroy past NBA teams, even as recently as half a decade ago, right? No team in the NBA would be able to handle the modern Warriors or Rockets or Raptors or Bucks with how they play ball. And then I kind of brought that up in terms of movies. A book I really liked on the subject, Devin, was called Everything Bad is Good for You. And one of the things this person does is he looks at like old television shows compared to modern television shows. And what he notices is like people are probably familiar with this terminology like A story, B story. So in a television show, like the main plot that's going on, and there's a side plot going on at the same time, and they kind of meet. And if you look at kind of complexity of old television shows with modern, it's not even close. And same with like music, etc. And so our argument is things have gotten better and more intelligent. But the point you made, Devin, is if you started looking at what was most popular, there's been a degradation in that. And I wanted to let you talk on that a little.
Yeah, so basically, and for me, it's people might debate about it when it comes to movies, but it's really painfully obvious, especially when it comes to music, where there's just been a very simplification of kind of music. So complexity, it has gotten, well, songs have gotten less complex. There are fewer instruments in songs. Songs are shorter. The words have a lower reading level, so they're not as complex. They repeat words. They tend to use the same musical notes and chords in all the top songs. So you can really see that from, say, the 60s to today, popular music, the songs that are at the top of the charts, have gone from complicated and unique and diverse to basically they're all the same song. And the same is true of the big popular movies, in the sense that most of them are the big budget blockbuster comic book movies. They're sequels, they're remakes, they're reboots, they're related to something that has already existed, maybe in a TV show or from a comic book.
And what gets fascinating here, I went to the numbers.com, Brian/market. It's the-numbers.com/market. It's one of my favorite sites for movie grosses and data. And one piece of information they have is tickets sold. And so in 1995, this hasn't been kept for perpetuity. Obviously, there's movie grosses, but tickets sold hasn't been tracked as well, a lot like the modern box score and NBA. But the top in the United States tickets sold movie was Batman Forever, which sold 42 million tickets. You fast forward to now, Avengers Endgame, 94 million tickets. Now, by the way, there was like a spike. Titanic, for what it's worth, had that record. But if you kind of look at how many people are seeing the movies at the very, very top, that number has just gotten bigger and bigger. So there's a bigger audience for it. And then a huge thing that no one's a fool about. This pained me a little, but Wonder Woman was touted as this proof of a female-led movie destroying the box office, and it was one of the top U.S. grossing movies of 2018, I think. The other problem is there was a movie called Aquaman that came out that didn't do as well in the United States as Wonder Woman, but beat it in the international market. And Brian and I have talked on this show before about it, how it is very U.S.-centric to say nobody in the U.S. likes this movie, and you go, the Warcraft movie is the best example. It's like, no one gives a damn about the U.S. This thing made hundreds of millions of dollars overseas. Everybody in the U.S. can sit this one out, and it's still worth our money.
Got killed by the critics, but there's going to be a sequel now because of China.
Well, did either of you watch it? Because I've actually
I watched it,
movie.
and you guys are going to hate me for this, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. I enjoyed that movie, despite it being bad.
This conversation, for what it's worth, like Devin might not talk the rest of the show just in sadness. We might do to CM Punk. We talked last week. CM Punk's brain got broken when he was told the WWE had started granting sick time off and vacation, and we might break Devin's brain admitting all the movies we like. This conversation started with me saying I actually liked the movie Aquaman. Yeah. All right. Okay. But anyway, the point being, the market that movies are aiming at is much, much bigger, and that's kind of the issue. And I know they've discussed this on other movie podcasts, like Crack.com has done some, where it's basically going, you've got these big studios that are gobbling up the IP, that are trying to make kind of a homogenous product for as many people as possible. And so it's not necessarily that all pop culture is getting worse or dumber, but it's the ones at the top that are being produced for everybody that suddenly are. And basically kind of in the 70s and 80s, the summer blockbuster and sequels kind of took over because, right, I think you were mentioning, right, at some point, the Godfather movie or movies were like the top movies in the United States cinema. And those were like R-rated, based on a novel, really serious movies.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the sequelitis problem, if you go year by year and look at the top movies, you can see how it gets worse and worse. And we actually looked at it for a little bit in our email thread, but I'm not going to get into it. But it's painfully obvious to see how many original movies, unique movies, actually make it to the top of the grossing numbers. But in terms of the blockbusters in the late 70s and 80s, to me, those movies, even at that time, those movies did not suffer from the same problems that modern movies do today, which, as you said, it has a lot to do with appealing to the international market. And by international market, we mean China, and just a wider audience in North America. And you guys like to say US, but I like to say North America, obviously.
Yeehaw, thanks for autoplay ads. Okay. And what's interesting, so the funny thing is you said there aren't a lot of originals, and what we do notice are movies like Wonder Woman or Crazy Rich Asians, or the recent one I've heard of is Hustlers. And there's these like the surprise breakout movies, and basically the way you can break it down is white people at a largely white male driven studio are shocked that people other than white males like movies. As an obvious example, look at the number of movies like Liam Neeson's career. The number of movies that boil down to old guy is upset with millennial problem, gets a gun and solves it, right? The most recent Liam Neeson movie is, right, his son dies because he gets involved in an opioid cartel, and Liam Neeson uses a snow plow to kill mobsters. I'm fairly certain I did not imagine this. And I only know this because of John Mulaney, a hilarious stand-up comedian who did a skit about this on SNL. But Charlton Heston did a movie where he was a drug mule, and he's an old guy that had to become a drug mule because he can't afford his medications or something. And he is the best drug mule. So he basically is like, I'm an old white guy, but I could smuggle drugs better than Mexicans who are stealing our drug smuggling jobs. There is a huge market in Hollywood because of the people that greenlight decisions. So I think that's part of the sequelitis problem is related to that. You say China as a market, and then this sequelitis problem. It's like you've got people in charge that want to greenlight things they know will be successful, and you could either learn more about Chinese culture and try and make movies that appeal to them, or you can go, we know action movies don't have a high barrier to entry. Yeah. Children in every nation can watch a scene where Thanos is swinging a sword at Thor and Captain America picks up a hammer, and it's awesome. And I was kind of bored, but whatever. That all can happen, and everybody understands what's going on. And that's much more difficult than trying to like make something easier. So it's get products that people know, make as cross-cultural as possible, and then don't piss off anybody in international markets. And then if a boardroom of a bunch of old white guys approves it, that's what gets made into a movie. And that's what we've basically seen become of the U.S. top charts.
Yeah, and that's also, and I mentioned this in our pre-show notes, but it's also why you start to see kind of more Chinese settings, like maybe something will be set in Beijing or Shanghai or somewhere else. Maybe Hong Kong is another one where you'll see those cities pop up more often in these big movies because they're kind of tapping into the Chinese market a little bit. So you see that sort of thing.
And I guess all I could say is I can't fault it. The only counter argument I had, there were two counter arguments I had. So sorry, not only, but one is I recently watched Superman 2, which is an old superhero movie. And from the point of movies getting worse, what I will say is the following. Superman 2 compared to Aquaman is miles and miles better. And there are lots of easy flaws with Aquaman and editing things, but like Superman 2, I hated all the characters. It was stupid. The Richard Donner cut was supposed to fix a lot of things, and it's still horrible and boring and all that. So I would argue, if we're looking at the types of movies being made, I would say recent variants of the old ones have indeed improved. They've gotten better editing tricks, probably better acting. Sadly, it does seem like screenwriting has probably gone by the wayside. I think people have just decided we know how to put a script together. We don't have to worry about it making sense. So it is what it is. I would say modern movies beat their past movies at that, but I would just say the type of movies that have become the ones to put at the top of the box office have shifted. It would be
mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of like it's almost like our favorite NBA time travel argument, where so modern movies have had years of movies to analyze and kind of improve on if they want to. So those types of things, the video editing, the sound quality, and all that stuff obviously is better. The resolution has gotten better. They have a lot of computer graphics, which to me is not necessarily a better thing in some cases, because some movies abuse the CGI when they could use actual real physical objects. But in terms of the screenwriting, they kind of they're homogenizing too, just like songs. So, okay, what's the movie going to be about? It's going to be about a hero who has to save the world from bad guy, from doing some evil thing. And then they have, set points they have to meet. Like at this time in the script, and it's always a he. He's doing this, and then he's doing this, and then he's doing this, and then he's doing this. And every movie basically meets that template of at least of the big blockbuster movies these days.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And yeah, I guess that is the funny part, is I would say that part hasn't really improved, but it's because they made a decision. They're like, we've got this recipe, just make, it's like we've discovered pizza, just keep improving the crust, improve the cheese. We don't want anything else. And the only other argument I've heard that's kind of good in this regard is because of technological advances, right? We have a podcast that's at least some, I would argue, certainly we don't compare to television. I'm not gonna argue that. But I would say you take the podcast that Brian produces, and Brian does this in his spare time with either low cost or free software on a machine that hates him. I think what your computer just regularly decides its hard drive doesn't work, right, Brian?
It's mostly Skype that's the problem. Everything else is pretty good.
Yeah, screw you, Skype. Skype keeps changing its UI needlessly. But if you compare like this to how shows would look in the 70s, it's comparable or better quality, which is impressive.
Right.
So there has been a huge opening for a lot more media to be produced that can be more innovative or creative. It's just the people in power producing the things for the masses have decided that like coherent stories don't matter. And I will actually argue, I'll get my last lick in on this, and then we'll see if we can maybe wrap up this subject. But like I was talking Aquaman, which I enjoyed, but I said something that bugs me that shows up all the time in modern movies because it just has to. You were saying, right, the midway point. There has to be a character, one of two types. There has to be the character like the Scully character from the X-Files who's just like, oh, Mulder, you don't know what you're talking about. How dare you think we should do this? Or there has to be like kind of the inverse of that, which is a character that's kind of warning people and everybody's like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? And then it turns out they're right. The recent Aquaman, there is a character that's a talking head on like CNN or Fox News, whatever you want to call it. And he is arguing that the city of Atlantis is real and they have modern technology. And, he's been studying it for years and discovering that Atlantis is real and they're going to wage war on humanity, which actually does happen in the movie. It's kind of cool. It's really weird. I would say Aquaman's another one of those movies where the villain, if you really examine them, you're like, are you really wrong? But anyway, so everybody's like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? But in this movie, this is the same freaking universe where Superman exists. And because they did the Justice League crossover, it's like, so all of you saw a man who can fly and destroy cities, fight an alien, and then fight a resurrected alien. That just happened. And you're really telling me that the talking heads on your television station are going to be like, you're telling me there's a race of advanced people living under the seas? You're crazy. It's like, what? Like, that doesn't even make coherent sense in your own universe. And that is one of my pet peeves in movies that adapt old tropes, but like forget to acknowledge them in the universes they've decided are important.
Well, so let me ask you guys about this. So the history of movies and producing movies, back in the beginning, there was what's called the studio system, right? Where the studios had all this power and they locked in the actors and directors for multiple pictures, and they didn't have a lot of power. And then that broke down eventually, right? And then by the time we got to, the 70s, like we were talking about here, there was, more different types of movies. So does it seem like we're pulling back into that old, studio system now, and maybe that's why movies are starting to flatten out a little bit more, and Marvel and Disney has all this control? Because like famously, some like for instance, Edgar Wright was going to do Ant-Man originally. He's this acclaimed action director who's done all these great action movies, but he just for whatever reason he didn't want to fit into this this Disney system. Kevin Feige, whose name we know how to pronounce now, does all this. He's like, no, I can't do it. So he got replaced, right? So maybe Disney's just saying, look, we got Kevin Feige. He can just run everything. We don't need to, pay all these writers and directors top dollar. So I don't know. Is that plausible? We're returning more to this studio style of production.
I can't speak to the old stock because I'm not really familiar with that stuff. But I think what we see in modern movies is that, as Trey was saying, you've got these big companies, these big film studios, and they bought up all the small ones, or maybe the small ones just died. That's another possibility. But basically, all we have left are these big ones, and Disney in particular owns everything. And they plan out their movies literally a decade ahead of time.
That's right.
And it doesn't, in many cases, it doesn't even matter if a movie is good or even successful, because they have this plan, this 10, 20-year plan, and they're going to stick to the damn plan no matter what. And kind of like sports fans, let's bring it back to sports, kind of like sports fans, people will show up for these movies no matter what. So even if you reboot Spider-Man 7 times in 7 years, which is what it seems like to me they've done, people will still keep showing up to watch the newest iteration of Peter Parker and his Uncle Ben and how that story starts all over again.
Well, I'd give two things to that. So like the rebooting Spider-Man, the reason a lot of that happens is ownership rights.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, we talked a lot of stupid litigious nature. Something that happened that was a big deal, and Disney fought for this, is there used to be copyright law that said like you got a copyright for like 50 years, some years. And after it expired, it went to public domain. And Disney lobbied really hard against that, which is why characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Goofy are not public domain, even though they should be. And then it's also done some weird stuff, loophole management, where Disney used to acquire public domain stories. That's why so many fairy tales are in their wheelhouse. And then they wouldn't have to pay anybody for that to make an adaptation, the exact same nostalgia kick we're talking about, right? Things people are familiar with. And then they've also done wonky stuff with that, where then they try and get ownership of the adapted version of something that was public domain. So there's been lots of weirdness there. So what you're saying about the studio system, right, where they're rebooting Spider-Man because there's some weird laws on the books that say we have to make it. One of the most infamous examples is a horrible Fantastic Four movie that never saw the light of day was made, and they made it for $1 million. And I feel bad because a bunch of people were like, you're making a Fantastic Four movie. And when it was done, they were like, we literally just needed to have a movie that screened at this many movie theaters so we could keep the rights to this intellectual property, which even no matter what you say about the Fantastic Four movies, because none of them are good, those were worth hundreds of millions of dollars in film rights. So there is that going on with the weird studio system, right? With the owning the IP argument, etc. And then just kind of like the stick to the plan sports fan thing. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, where it's just going, we know this is going to make money, so we'll keep pushing it.
Yeah, and so if we're basically finished on that, my last kind of comment on movies is it's an old Family Guy reference, and Family Guy suffered from the kind of the same problems that movies had, which is as it got more popular, it just wasn't that good. But the old Family Guy, before it got canceled, still has some great stuff, and one of the things in it is, for some reason, it doesn't really matter why, but the main characters are at a TV studio. And so they just show a boardroom filled with TV studio type people. And one person just says something like, let's have a TV show where a single white lawyer does blah, blah, blah. And everyone goes, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And then one guy at the table says, are you guys even listening to yourselves? This is the same old crap over and over and over. And then the guy who's clearly the head honcho there slowly walks over to the guy, grabs a painting, and hits him over the head a lot of times. So it just kind of drives home that, even this would have been like 1999. So even back then, people knew that TV studios, movie studios, they're not about risk. They're more about what's safe, keep doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. And that's why we see a lot of movies and TV shows kind of have the same premises and same storylines that show up all the time.
and to slowly relate this to sports and end it on that, which is good, right? Because we are a sports show. I've noticed something, and this has happened multiple times in my time with Wages of Wins and Boxscore Geeks. You notice someone who's an outspoken person, very much like we are, Brian, on Twitter or the internet. And then eventually they approach or get approached by a team, and you notice them slowly move their thinking and become nicer. And like Bill James, right, was, if you look at Bill James's old writing, and then he's like, the studio system, I have great respect for people that take risks, that, actually have to run a team more so than others. You notice that when you get close to these big systems, these people that were very analytics and suddenly start changing, and maybe there's a thinking to the usage curve or whatever. And I've seen that, like, it's been very obvious to people. I'm like, you're getting close to a team or an owner or whatever. And so it's the very same thing in the studio system, where when you're a new up and comer with, spitting fire, you have your own thoughts. And then as you approach this big monolithic money making machine, you slowly get homogenized, and that happens in sports as well. And it just is what it is. But
I don't know what you call this, but this is kind of like the insider versus outsider bias. Like, insiders are going to be biased in a certain way, and I think outsiders like me are as well. But my last thing on the movies is, I think the studios have, they always just want to maximize profits, right? Like, maybe some want to make artsy movies or whatever, but that's really what it's all about. What I'm getting out of all this is that, since this period of time we're talking about, the 1970s, maybe when movies were more artsy, I think Disney and other studios just have more sophisticated techniques nowadays to repeatedly make these successful movies the way they want to. I'm sure they would have done it back then if they could, but they just didn't know how to. So, yeah, I agree with all the points about how this is just time moving on and building on what was in the past.
It's more like NFL head coaches minimizing risk. Because it's like,
right.
We can and not get fired and still make lots of money, or we can do a risk. And there are lots of fun stories, like Treasure Island. There was a movie with Gina Davis, a pirate movie that nobody wanted to make, and it tanked a studio. And everybody's going to use that as when Pirates of the Caribbean came out, everybody had to have been thinking that. They basically tricked Pirates of the Caribbean into becoming a movie. So, and by the way, I've got to give a shout out because I realized it didn't come up organically in the talk. But Devin, when we were talking back and forth you said Lindsay Ellis. Go look up Lindsay Ellis. She has made some fantastic videos, a lot about studio history. Like, one of the funny things that you've been talking, Devin, that is ringing a bell to me. She had something about like the death of the musical, and it's actually reminding me a lot of Disney now, where you just had these huge movies, musicals that were making tons and tons of money, and they just kept shooting them out, and they were like an obvious moneymaker, right? Don't forget Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, right? There was a period when Julie Andrews was like the biggest name. She was the Robert Downey Jr. of her era. And then you would have said, well, musicals are the movies. And a decade later, they disappeared, right? And so you might wonder if like Marvel movies are the same thing going on. It might take a while longer. But yeah, so Lindsay Ellis has some great stuff about film history and all that. And like I said, when you talk about the studios really being more like, NFL head coaches.
Yeah, she has a lot of analysis on particular movies if you're interested. She has some criticizing of certain, I don't know if we want to say them, but, certain Disney movies or even fantasy movies. Yeah. So she's got a lot of stuff.
As you mentioned, she was nominated for a Hugo for her great talk on how it's like the Olympics. The Lord of the Rings movies were very much like the Olympics to New Zealand, where they're this big company with lots of money that came in, and it was like, it's going to help local commerce. It's going to help people. And shocker, when a big company asks for a lot of public money to do something, maybe they don't have the public's best interest at heart. Who knew? Well, we tied everything together. I think that's everything. I've got one shout out. I'll let you each get one, and that'll be our show. Odell Beckham Jr. If you've been listening to us and haven't watched the clip of his amazing one-handed near the end zone catch from tonight over and over and over again, I don't know what's wrong with you. It's amazing. So that's my shout out. And that happened right before the show started, Brian, and I almost just canceled the show to just keep watching that.
Awesome. No, I don't have any shouts. Just thanks to you guys for coming on. And we probably will be talking more about NCAA in California and WNBA in the coming weeks.
If we want to do a shout out, I don't know if shout outs always have to be positive.
No, negative ones are good. Negative ones are good.
But okay, so you were talking about Dre. You were talking about NFL head coaches not taking a risk. Well, in week 2, the Cardinals coach, and I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he's
Kyle
a new
Kingsbury,
coach.
or is it Cliff Kingsbury? One of the Kingsburys.
Yeah, I think it's. Actually, I won't say because I don't really know. But anyways, he had chances to go for it on 4th down like 5 times. It was 4 or 5 times, and he kicked on all of them, I think it was.
And that's funny considering his offense is the 4 wide receiver run and shoot variant almost that's supposed to be so aggressive. But when it comes to 4th down, no.
Yeah, so it was pretty ridiculous because it was supposed to be a fast pace and whatnot offense, and then that happened. So that was fun.
I don't mind shouting out people for being examples of the things we say they shouldn't do. All right. Well, that's been our show. This has been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you find us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. Sorry. We go live every week, Mondays, usually at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Special guest Devin Dignam, who you can find on Twitter as Devin Dignam. That's spelled Dignam. Is that the best place? Anything else you want to shout out of your own, Devin?
No, I'm laying pretty low these days.
Yeah, it's fun times after, if you're like me, you still get Kobe fans from years and years ago finding old stuff yelling at you. So is what it is. So Devin Dignam on Twitter. We've got Brian Foster. You can find his Boxscore Brian on Twitter. And myself, Dre Alvarez. You can find his Nerd Numbers on Twitter. Twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers, channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. I think that's everything, Brian. You did the outro last time and did amazing. I think I should have you start doing it.
I didn't quite get it all. iTunes and Stitcher also.
Oh, okay. There you go. See? All right. Next week, Brian does the outro.
I forgot to say YouTube, I think.
Oh, what?
I forgot to say YouTube last week.
I said YouTube this time, though. So,
yep,
okay.
You got it. We are on YouTube.
We will get a full outro at some point, even though we've been doing this for years. All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.